You're very kind. Thank you very much. How's the sound on this? Is it echoing a bit and booming, or is it? It's good. All right, that's good news. I owe everything to my readers. Thank you for being here. I'm enormously grateful. I have spent the last hour and a half signing and dedicating and taking pics, and I just want to be clear, I won't leave the building until I've met everybody who wants to meet me and signed every book. I will be here. Thank you. So, I wish we could get these off, but I guess we can't. And I'm afraid that some of you are not going to be able to see the screen, which is an important part of the story I'm telling, but we'll try and work our way around that. So this is a book about ancient America, and naturally I begin with ancient Egypt. And there's a reason for that, which will become clear. We are looking at the ancient Egyptian pyramid texts here. They're so called because they're written inside pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties at Saqqara in Upper Egypt, about 15 or 20 miles south of the famous Giza necropolis. Unlike the Giza monuments, the pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties do contain texts. None of the great pyramids of Giza contain any inscriptions at all, and there's a reason for that too. You can get translations of these texts. The ancient Egyptian pyramid texts are translated in the Faulkner edition, which I recommend, and they're part of a body of literature which include the ancient Egyptian coffin texts, which are written inside coffin lids, and the famous Book of the Dead, which was written on papyrus scrolls and placed inside the chest cavity of the mummy. And over here on the left, we have the book of what is in the Duat. And the Duat was the name that the ancient Egyptians gave to the afterlife realm. They had fully formed from the very beginning of ancient Egyptian civilization was very sophisticated ideas about what happens to us when we die. And this is a matter that our civilization wishes to set aside and not consider, and you know, we all kind of feel we're immortal in some way, but what death does is it gives perspective and meaning to our lives, and some of the ancient civilizations put their best minds to work on this problem for many years, and we should not dismiss the conclusions they came to. So for the ancient Egyptians, the Duat was in the sky, and the central feature of the Duat was the Milky Way, beside which stands the constellation of Orion. And when the ancient Egyptians looked up at the constellation of Orion, they saw it as the celestial figure of their deity Osiris, who was the god of resurrection and rebirth, who presided over the afterlife realm. In a sense, what is implied here, we see him on the ceiling of the Temple of Dendera surrounded by stars, is that Orion, Osiris, is the entry to the afterlife realm. You make your entry to it through effectively a portal in the constellation of Orion. I want to pay tribute to the work of my friend and colleague Robert Boval here, who originally came up with the Orion correlation theory, recognizing the similarity between the 3 great pyramids on the ground and the 3 belt stars of the constellation of Orion. As I mentioned, these pyramids have no texts within them serving as a guidebook to the afterlife realm. And the reason for that is that they are actually a 3-dimensional model of the afterlife realm on the ground. They built the Duat on the ground. I am not saying that those who made this incredible site actually put the Nile River there, but I do suggest that it was amongst the reasons why they chose this site, because we have this extraordinary aspect of sky-ground mirroring, as above, so below. The Milky Way in the sky and the Nile on the ground, and the 3 great pyramids and the 3 belt stars of the constellation of Orion, Osiris, and then rising at the equinox, the constellation of Leo and the Leonine Great Sphinx. The mystery about this diagram, however, this 3-dimensional model, is that it does not show the sky above Giza in the time that the pyramids are supposed to have been made, 4,500 years ago. This is the sky above Giza pretty much between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. The positions of the stars all change because of a wobble on the Earth's axis, and since the Earth is the viewing platform from which we observe the stars, that's why this happens. That period is known to geology. It's called the Younger Dryas, and it was a period of enormous cataclysm, global cataclysm on the Earth. So it's intriguing that this sky in which we see the afterlife realm is set in the remote past, not in the time that the pyramids are supposed to have been built. So sticking with the notion of Giza as a three-dimensional model, they give us the idea of how the soul of the deceased was supposed to rise up from ground to sky, because there's a narrow shaft cut through the southern side of the Great Pyramid, which targets at what is called meridian transit, the lowest of the three stars of Orion's belt. It's angled directly to target that star. And it's recognized as a star shaft or a soul shaft by which the soul would leap up to the constellation of Orion and then pass through a portal in Orion to the banks of the Milky Way and make a journey along the Milky Way, and there be confronted by challenges and ordeals and required to account for the life we have lived. And the fundamental question was, you were given the precious opportunity to be born in a human body. What did you do with it? Did you use it well, or did you waste it? I've never expected to come across a similar system of ideas, in many ways often identical, at Moundville in Alabama. I was overtaken by a profound sense of déjà vu as I wandered around that site and started to look at the exhibits in the museum. And that's when I learned that the constellation of Orion was central to the ancient religion of the Mississippi Valley. And they figured Orion not as a man in the sky, but as a hand, a forearm and a hand with the fingers pointed downwards, and a kind of eye, which is in fact a portal in the palm of the hand. And this is how it works. Orion's belt is the wrist of the hand constellation, and other stars are the fingers and the thumb of the hand constellation. And the portal in the palm of the hand is the Orion Nebula, which lies directly beneath the three stars of Orion's belt. So I'm just going to read you some passages from the notice boards at Moundville Museum, and anybody can go see these and confirm this for themselves. The gateway or portal between the celestial realms and the Earth disk was symbolized and artistically rendered as an open hand with an eye in its palm. We know this hand as part of the constellation of Orion. Once the portal was crossed, the souls of the dead began their journey by walking along a road or ribbon of light, the Milky Way. And in the Mississippi Valley, the Milky Way was known as the Path of Souls. And Moundville became a place where people brought their dead to be buried from all over the Mississippi Valley. And it became, in the minds of its people, not only the symbolic gateway to the realm of the dead, but also the materialized image of that sacred domain on Earth. And it was impossible for me to read that without remembering how the monuments of the Giza Plateau are a materialized image of the duats on the ground. The peoples of the Mississippi Valley did not have a written language. They used symbolism, intense, beautiful symbolism, and fortunately, a number of Native American peoples still survive today who have cultural connections with the Mississippi Valley civilization. So a large group of scholars have got together with Native American peoples and have successfully cracked the code of Mississippi Valley civilization. And one of those scholars is George Langford. And what he's telling us here is that the soul must reach the portal in the hand by making a leap at the optimum time. In other words, just as in ancient Egypt the soul leaps up to the constellation of Orion, so in the Mississippi Valley there's this leap up to the hand constellation. And George Langford draws attention to one of those challengers on the path of souls, who is a woman, a female figure. And her task is to destroy memory and humanity by removing or smashing the brain. She was called the brain smasher or the brain taker. Her role really is the annihilation and permanent destruction of unworthy souls, of the damned on the afterlife journey. So I was really intrigued by this vignette from the book of What is in the Duat, which was translated in the early 1900s by Sir E.A. Wallace Budge, who was the keeper of Egyptian antiquities at the British Museum. And he did not translate the hieroglyphs in these scenes, but what he tells us of the scene, which I've expanded here, is that it represents a goddess standing upright with her hands stretched out to the top of the head of a man who is kneeling before her and is cutting open his head with a hatchet. As I looked at that scene, not being able to translate hieroglyphs myself, I couldn't help but feel that the goddess was not trying to stop the man doing that. It felt more that she was exerting will or power to make him smash out his own brains. But I needed to know what her role was. So I went to the British Museum and I contacted an expert in hieroglyphs there, Louise Ellis Barrett, and I asked her to translate these specific hieroglyphs for me concerning the role of that goddess. And she said, why do you want me to do this? And I said, I'm not going to tell you. Because I don't want to influence your translation. Just translate it for me. We did a deal, and a couple of weeks later she came back with the translation, and this is what she came back with concerning the role of that goddess. She lives from the blood of the damned, and from what these gods provide her, that bar soul who belongs to the damned, the demolishing one who cuts the damned to pieces. In other words, she is a brain smasher and a brain taker, just as we find in the Mississippi Valley. The ancient Egyptian netherworld was full of monstrous winged serpents. They're a universal feature of the ancient Egyptian netherworld, and we find monstrous winged serpents in the iconography of the Mississippi Valley representations of the netherworld, as well as challengers on the path of souls. Another challenger on the path of souls was called in the Mississippi Valley the underwater panther. And my wife Santha, who I forgot to pay credit to at the beginning of this talk, to whom actually I owe everything. I would not be here if it hadn't been for Santha, and Santha's taken the majority of the pictures that we're seeing tonight. This is just a little clay figure of the underwater panther that Santha photographed in the Manville Museum. And I'm intrigued by the similarities to the Great Sphinx of Giza. Scale is different, but the creature is seemingly the same. I and my colleagues have argued for many years that the Sphinx is much older than the dynastic period of ancient Egypt, that it dates back more than 12,000 years, but it was originally a lion-bodied, as well as not only a lion-bodied, but also a lion-headed monument. And that the lion head became damaged over thousands of years, and that in dynastic times it was cut down into this human head, and that's the reason why the head is so out of proportion with the rest of the body. But I'm struck by the appearance of the paws of the underwater panther and the paws of the Sphinx, and the way the tail wraps around the back of the underwater panther, and the same with the Sphinx. It could be a coincidence, but as these coincidences keep mounting, you begin to wonder what's going on, if something's going on behind the scenes of history. The ancient Egyptians had a hero deity who was Horus, and he represented the triumph of life over death. And Horus was depicted as a man with the body of a man, but with the head of a hawk. There is an identical figure in the ancient Mississippi Valley. He was called the Bird Man. He also represented the triumph of life over death. And he also, as we see carved on a whelk shell here, has a human figure at the head of a hawk. Let's jump over to the Amazon rainforest for a moment, where we find a mysterious visionary beverage called ayahuasca. And I have had a fair amount of experience with ayahuasca since I first encountered it in 2003 whilst researching my book Supernatural. I guess I've had 70 or so ayahuasca ceremonies because this is a teacher plant and she has taught me extraordinary lessons. And I feel I'm still enrolled in that school, even though I have to brace myself for the next classroom. It's very normal in ayahuasca visions to meet intelligent entities who communicate with you telepathically and who often have human bodies and animal heads. But even more universal is geometry. Geometry is reported by almost everybody sooner or later who drinks ayahuasca. And there have been scientific studies of this that compare the experiences of people all over the world. And what we're looking at here is the art of the Shipibo, an ayahuasca drinking culture of the Amazon. They paint it on pottery and they sew it into weavings, and it's full of detailed geometrical figures. Another Amazonian culture that revolves around ayahuasca are the Tucano. And for the Tucano, ayahuasca is so important that a teaspoonful of ayahuasca is given to each newborn babe at birth. And in Western cultures, we kind of tend to react with instinctive horror at that thought of a powerful psychedelic being given to an infant. But in the Amazon, the feeling is that we are surrounded by an invisible reality, and that it is dealing with us whether we like it or not. And that we need to be proactive in the way that we deal with it. And they regard ayahuasca as the portal to that realm, which is intimately connected to the realm of death. And that's why ayahuasca is called the vine of the dead. And here in these images, which are, we see a Tucano Paye, that's how they call their shamans, guiding his son through an ayahuasca experience, helping him navigate the infinite terrain of the other side. Any member of the Tucano community may drink ayahuasca, but when there's important work to be done on behalf of the tribe, a group of shamans will gather together. And I'm going to quote here from the work of Gerardo Reichel Dolmatov, who was one of the leading anthropologists studying Amazonian cultures and particularly studying the Tucano. And what he says is that a group of shamans will gather together, they drink enormous quantities of ayahuasca, they lie down in their hammocks and then, quote, they feel they are ascending to the Milky Way, that theme again. And this ascent to the Milky Way is not easily accomplished, and the apprentice may only get a few feet off the ground. But as more work is done with ayahuasca and his experience is gained, the leap to the sky gets higher and higher, and so until at last, in a single soaring flight, he will reach the zenith. And I think you will agree that there are points in common with the ancient Egyptian and the Mississippi Valley system, the notion of a portal to the realm of the dead, of a leap to the sky, and so on. The Tucano have an intriguing origin myth. They say that their people were not originally from the Amazon, that in a remote period, thousands and thousands of years ago in the past, their ancestors were brought to the Amazon by a group of supernaturals. And I'll be upfront about this. I interpret those supernaturals as the survivors of a lost civilization. I'm going to put those supernaturals in inverted commas. And amongst them were the daughter of the sun, who gave the ancestors of the Tucano the gift of fire and the knowledge of horticulture and pottery making and many other crafts. And their journey along the Amazon River system was made in a serpent-shaped canoe, steered by a supernatural helmsman. And the purpose of these supernaturals was to point out to the ancestors of the Tucano the best places to settle, where they could make their fields, where they would get the best hunting, where they could make their villages. And then they left them there, and their descendants are still there to this day. Oddly enough, a rather similar story is told at the Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt. And it's told in a group of texts that are known as the Edfu building texts, which are written between the inner and outer enclosure walls of that temple. And these texts, which are deeply inscribed, tell us themselves that they are not originals, that they are copies of much older documents which had been in the archives of the temple that had stood on that site formerly before the temple that I showed you the image of was built. And that archive had been adopted by the new temple, and amongst it were documents written on animal skins that were falling apart, and the priests felt that they were so important that they preserved them in these texts. And in a way, it tells the story of Atlantis, because what it speaks of is an enormous island called the homeland of the primeval ones, the gods, and how they came to Egypt and established religion by building primeval mounds up and down the land. No, they were not from Egypt originally. Egypt was a place that they came to. And then we hear that the homeland of the primeval ones was subject to a cataclysm, that something that's described as a snake or a great serpent leapt down from the sky and struck the homeland of the primeval ones in an assault and split it, and then floodwaters poured in, and the divine inhabitants, the majority of them, died. But there were survivors, and we're told that those survivors wandered the world. And they made it their project to try to restart their former world of their gods, or their lost civilization, in my view. That this project was not only pursued in Egypt, but that it was pursued in many, many other lands as well. And I suggest that South America, specifically the Amazon rainforest, was one of those lands. The Amazon basin is truly an extraordinary phenomenon. It covers 7 million square kilometers, and although there have been tragic clearances of the rainforest, we still have 5.5 million square kilometers that are covered by dense jungle. And to put that in perspective, that is larger than the entire Indian subcontinent. So it's just a fact that very little archaeology has been done in the Amazon. Some has been done, and I'll touch on it, and it's important and it's mind-blowing in some ways. But very little has been done. Absolutely minuscule areas of the Amazon have been studied, and I don't blame the archaeologists for that, because the Amazon is an incredibly difficult place to work, and very expensive place to work. And yet, for archaeology to claim that it's pretty much got the picture of our past right, while it's left an area the size of the Indian subcontinent pretty much out of the story, seems to me just a little bit premature. Here's a British newspaper called the Daily Mail. It's a sensational tabloid, and it loves sensational headlines. And here's the headline from July 2015: "Were Aborigines the first Americans? Native tribes in the Amazon found to be most closely related to indigenous Australians." This is one of the cases where the science behind the headlines is even more sensational than the headlines themselves. And the science was initially published in the highly respected peer-reviewed scientific journal Nature in 2015. And what it draws attention to is a very curious DNA signal. That DNA signal is found only amongst Australasians, from Melanesians from Papua New Guinea and Australian Aborigines, and amongst certain tribes in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, and is found nowhere else. And this is very puzzling, because the peopling of the Americas is supposed to have happened up through East Asia, through Siberia, across the Bering Straits, when the Bering Straits were a land bridge during the last ice age, when sea level was 400 feet lower than it is today. Archaeologists call that area Beringia, and thence into Alaska, and down through Canada, through North America, through Central America, and into South America. If that traditional story of the peopling of the Americas that we've been taught were true, we would expect to find that Australasian genetic signal in North America and in Central America, as well as in South America. But the fact that we only find it in South America suggests that some kind of direct journey was made across the Pacific Ocean. And we know that this is very old. This is a recent paper from the journal Cell, published in November 2018. Skeletal remains from more than 10,000 years ago are very rare anywhere in the world. They're particularly rare in the Amazon with its acidic soils. But by good fortune, skeletal remains were found at Lagoa Santa in Brazil and are dated to 10,400 years ago. And those skeletal remains contain the same Australasian DNA signal that is found amongst surviving tribes in the Amazon today. And that tells us that that signal reached South America at least 10,400 years ago. And probably before that, because we just, as I say, so much of the Amazon has not been surveyed, and the scientists behind it suggest that it must have reached South America in the late Pleistocene, which is just a fancy word for the Ice Age. In other words, it reached South America near the end of the last Ice Age. So that's the puzzle. Why do we get this DNA signal in Australasia and in the heart of the Amazon jungle, but not anywhere else? It really does look like somebody crossed the Pacific Ocean during the last Ice Age. I got in touch with some of the leading geneticists in the study of ancient DNA, some of the scholars behind these papers in Nature, and I talked at length with Professor S.G. Willerslev of the universities of Cambridge and Copenhagen. And he admitted that currently nobody has a good explanation for that Australasian DNA signal in the Amazon. That everything that's put forward to explain it is speculative, but he did list a number of possibilities, and amongst them he said this, that someone holding this signal comes into the Americas, not through Beringia, but crossing into South America across the ocean. Based purely on the genetic data, this is the most parsimonious explanation. When a scientist says that an explanation is parsimonious, he or she are saying they like that explanation. because it's simple, it's clear, it's direct, it's kind of the obvious explanation, and often obvious explanations are the right ones in science. But, Willerslev added, it doesn't make practical sense. And I asked him, why doesn't it make practical sense? And he said, well, I've talked to archaeologists about this, and they've told me that no human population was capable of crossing a major ocean during the last ice age. By all means, yes, the Polynesian expansion 3,500 years ago, they were amazing navigators, but you can't push that back 12 or 13,000 years ago. And I said, are you sure the archaeologists are right about that? And he quite rightly said, look, in science, we trust the work of other scientists and we rely on it, and archaeologists have told me this, so I don't think it makes practical sense. Well, those who followed my work will know that I've long argued that there was a global navigating and seafaring civilization during the Ice Age. I won't go into the details here, they are in the book. For example, the many ancient maps that have survived with accurate longitudes that show the world as it looked during the last Ice Age. Evidence of a navigational science during the last Ice Age. The Amazon seems like a most unlikely place to find evidence of science, but we do find it in the Amazon. There are more than 150,000 different species of plants and trees in the Amazon. But you have to select just 2 of these plants and trees, just 2 out of that 150,000 different species, neither of which is psychoactive on its own. You have to put them together to make the brew that we call ayahuasca, the vine of souls. And one of them is this plant, it's known as Chakruna in the Amazon. The botanical name is Psychotria viridis, and its leaves contain dimethyltryptamine. I don't like the word hallucinogen, it carries baggage, it implies that the experiences received are without value, that they're somehow trivial, but I'll use it here. It's the most powerful hallucinogen known to science. And most of us in the West experience DMT by smoking it or vaping it. I've had, I guess, 15 or 16 smoked and vaped DMT trips myself. It's truly a rocket ship to the other side of reality. I mean, you know, once you hit the right dose, the matter is out of your hands entirely. And you are taken off to another universe, which pours in on you at enormous speed with huge numbers of impressions, a lot of geometry, intelligent entities, very tricksy. It's overwhelming. And the journey is short. It's 8 to 12 minutes. It's a very rapid journey, although it feels much longer when you're inside it. And I do remember one of my most terrifying DMT trips. I've had some beautiful ones, but this one was terrifying. As I entered into that space, a voice spoke to me thunderously and said, "You are ours now." And I replied, "Shit, yes, but only for 8 minutes." And then I kind of blanked, and I was just the most extraordinary, the feeling of a huge download of information, but I couldn't process it. I've never been able to process it properly. What ayahuasca does is it makes DMT orally accessible. You see, DMT, that's why we smoke it or vape it in the West. There's an enzyme in the gut called monoamine oxidase that shuts off DMT on contact. So you could make a tea theoretically out of hundreds of these Chakruna leaves and drink all of it, and it would not have a psychoactive effect on you at all. What you have to do is you have to cook it together with the ayahuasca vine. And the ayahuasca vine contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Therefore, it allows the DMT in the leaves to be absorbed orally, and the ayahuasca vine also brings something else to the party. In the Amazon, they regard ayahuasca as the intelligence behind this whole project, that it has harnessed those leaves to its purpose. I regard this as science. Go figure how you do that out of 150,000 different species of plants and trees in the Amazon. Trial and error? Come on. I mean, this is extraordinary, really. New World monkeys have a characteristic that is not shared by Old World monkeys. They have prehensile tails. This is very important for the hunter-gatherers of the Amazon, who depend on monkeys for a substantial quota of their protein. If you see a monkey a couple of 100 feet up a tree and you shoot it with an arrow that is not tipped with curare, you may kill the monkey, but as it falls from the tree in an automatic reaction, its prehensile tail will whip up and wrap around a branch, and suddenly dinner is 200 feet above you and very difficult to acquire. But if you use curare on your arrowhead, which is a neuromuscular toxin which causes all the muscles in the body to relax completely, then the prehensile tail cannot wrap around the tree, the monkey falls at your feet, and dinner is served. Curare consists of 11 different ingredients. None of them are effective on their own. They all have to be put together before you get this medicine, which in fact is the basis of modern anesthesiology. This is where we've learned from the peoples of the Amazon. We use synthetics today, but it was originally curare that was used in the first anesthetics. This is Francisco de Orellana, and he was the first European to cross the entire width of South America, the entire width of the Amazon rainforest. He started out with about 200 men in Ecuador, and they crossed the Andes mountain range and came down into the foothills, into the Amazon basin. And their project was to find El Dorado. The Spanish conquistadors were obsessed with gold. But they initially had very, very poor fortune. They couldn't feed themselves. They couldn't find enough food. Being resourceful, they built a boat by the side of the Amazon, and 50 of them, led by Orellana, piled into it. And their project was to go away and to go hunting and to bring back food to the base camp. But the Amazon River disagreed. They started off on that boat on the 26th of December, 1541. The stream of the Amazon carried them very rapidly downstream. They could not return and row the boat back against the current. They were carried right the way across the whole length of the Amazon River system, more than 4,000 kilometers, until on the 26th of August, 1542, they ended up in the Atlantic Ocean. After that voyage, Orellana reported seeing signs of high civilization in the Amazon. He reported seeing enormous populations, huge cities larger than the cities of Europe at that time, advanced arts and crafts, every evidence of high civilization. And yet 100 years later, when other Europeans went into the Amazon, they couldn't find any traces of this. And the conclusion for several centuries was that Orellana had made it all up, that it was a fantasy. But it wasn't a fantasy. He was right. The problem was the Spaniards brought smallpox into the Amazon. And that smallpox utterly destroyed the indigenous populations who had no resistance to it. Within 50 years, the cities were overgrown and deserted. 100 years later, they were completely covered by jungle, and that's why nobody saw them. But today, sadly, because of the clearances of the Amazon, they are being revealed. Roughly since 2009, we've known that these cities exist. Here's an example: Lost Garden cities, pre-Columbian life in the Amazon. Hundreds of examples have been found of these huge settlements that once existed. And archaeologists now, and this is the mainstream, accept that there was, prior to the Spanish conquest, a population of around 20 million people in the Amazon. And that's astonishing. Because rainforest soils are not particularly fertile. They maintain their fertility through the mulch of leaves that falls from the trees, but you cut down the trees, make a field, and within a decade you've got barren soil. So how did they do it? They did it by inventing a soil, a man-made soil, an anthropogenic soil, and examples of it still exist. The oldest surviving examples that have been found go back more than 8,000 years. And again, I would suggest they go back much further. It's just that the research has not been done. It's very mysterious. It contains millions of species of bacteria that are not found in neighboring soils. And you can take a handful of 8,000-year-old terra preta and add it to barren soil, and it will turn that soil fertile instantly. It's a kind of miracle soil. And again, it speaks to a lost science that was in the Amazon. Another feature are the huge earthworks that are emerging in the Amazon, which are rightly called geoglyphs because they're highly geometric in their character. And those that have been found so far have been found primarily in the southwestern Amazon in the Brazilian state of Acre. And I'll show some examples here. These are all on scales of hundreds of meters, geometric figures with large embankments and deep ditches within them, sometimes square in form. Here we see a square enclosing a circle at Jacosá. Here at Fazenda Cipoal we see an octagon surrounding a square. And again, the scale is truly enormous. At Ramal do Capatara, a pair of circles joined together. At Fazenda Atlântica, a square and a circle. Taquino is a very striking site on a very large scale with huge squares and internested squares within them. The larger of the two squares there measures 210 by 210 meters along each side. Fazenda Pirana and Severino Calazans again are combinations of square figures, but in this case some measurements have been done, and it turns out that these geoglyphs are perfectly oriented to true north, true south, true east, and true west. And that tells us not only were geometers at work in the Amazon, but also astronomers were at work in the Amazon, because you can't get that precision of alignment without using astronomy. And oddly enough, Severino Calazans, the larger of the two squares, has the same footprint as the Great Pyramid of Giza, measuring 230 meters along each side. This site is called Fazenda Colorada. I'm showing two images of it here and a map that has been created by the archaeologists that show the nature of the site, a combination of circles, squares, and then a curious open square with internested squares within it. What's intriguing about this site is that, again from Gerardo Reichel Dolmatov's study of the Tucano have an image of the entrance to the other world that they frequently depict after ayahuasca visions, and it shows these internested but not closed squares, and it's very similar to this figure from that site in the Upper Amazon. So I just wonder, there's no evidence that these sites were used for habitation. There's no habitation refuse in them at all. They appear to have been used for some other purpose, and I wonder if that purpose was to do with that same mystery of life after death that we find explored in the Amazon, in the Mississippi Valley, and in ancient Egypt. Certainly there's a lot of geometry in the ancient Egyptian afterlife realm, huge squares, circles, and even pyramids in the afterlife realm. I think we all know that the sun doesn't rise and set in the same places on the horizon each day of the year, that at the summer solstice it rises in the northern hemisphere furthest north of east, and at the winter solstice furthest south of east, and at the equinoxes perfectly due east. As well as these huge earthworks in the Amazon, there are also megaliths in the Amazon, and there are